Okay, so everybody, welcome. I cannot believe that this is now episode number 26. There is something magical about that because we've been doing this about every 2 weeks since the lockdown started. 26 times 2, 52 weeks. We actually started this back, let's see, our first episode was in April, early April, a year ago with Lou Bryson. Okay. And here we have tonight, we have the pleasure of welcoming Cameron George, who is the National Brand Ambassador for Ardbeg. Cameron, please introduce yourself. Say hello to everybody.
Awesome. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Cameron George, and as you already gave me a very strong introduction, I am the National Ambassador and Educator on behalf of Ardbeg here in the United States. I'm very excited to be lucky number 26 to be able to join you. That was a wonderful display of amazing mathematical skills as well. So tip of the cap for all you members, and thank you for having me on. And I'm super excited and very enthusiastic about joining you.
That is wonderful. So let me ask you a question here. Why is it that you want us to start with our three expressions? Why is it that we are starting, everybody, with the Ardbeg 10?
Absolutely. Yeah. I find that Ardbeg tenure, in addition to just being magical, you used one of my favorite words right off of the bat whenever I'm describing Ardbeg. Is just pure magic, right? And this whiskey adds a lot of context to the distillery's kind of thumbprint and the DNA. To know Ardbeg tenure, to love Ardbeg tenure is really to love the Ardbeg distillery. I can think of no other whiskey within Ardbeg's core range or extended range that allows me to relive the experience of standing, multiple experiences of standing on the pier at Ardbeg, looking out over the ocean and having that sea spray just thrown up into my face. It really just very much so encapsulates the provenance of Ardbeg distillery.
Okay, so let's talk about it then. Tell us about the mash bill. Tell us about differences one year to the next in Ardbeg 10. What goes into this and why is it as wonderful as it is?
Absolutely, absolutely. So first and foremost, I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a little bit of a cheers and a slanjava. Thank you for having me, because I find that just these things go so much better when we get a little bit of this imbibe into us as quickly as possible. So cheers, slanjava. That tastes like home. God, I love that. So every single time, this whiskey always just, it is so powerful, and it's got this like teleportive aspect to it, where it just takes me away from this wonderful hotel, the Wyndham here in Charleston, and just plops me right back down in front of the stills at Ardbeg. First and second fill ex-bourbon casks add a lot of framework, right? All of the whiskeys at Ardbeg and all the whiskeys that we're going to taste tonight are built with first and second fill ex-bourbon cask as their heartbeat and their backbone. Even when we move into whiskeys like Corrievrecken and wthe, which in wthe obviously is going to have a sherry component, in Corrievrecken you're going to be talking about virgin oak. But in each of those whiskeys, as well as every other whiskey that Ardbeg makes, we don't finish whiskeys, we assemble them. So you had on, I believe a few weeks ago, my good friend Dan Crowell from Glenmorangie. We like to refer to Glenmorangie of the two whiskeys as a little bit more like the cigarette boat, or the speed boat, where it's a little bit easier to turn that. It's a little bit more agile. With Ardbeg, this is a large, lumbering cruise liner. You can actually even get that aspect when you move it around in its glass, and you can see the weight. You can actually see the lipids, these fusels that start to cling to the sides of the glass before it starts to kind of fall back down into the bowl if you're using a wonderful Glencairn. And so what I find with Ardbeg is that the reason that we don't finish whiskeys is because it's very difficult to turn a cruise liner on a dime, right? So the reason that we assemble whiskeys, and what I mean by that is that we will put down spirit into ex-bourbon cask, into sherry cask, into virgin American oak cask. We'll put some down into virgin French oak cask. And we'll use these as components or as ingredients. So technically the recipe for Ardbeg doesn't ever change. It's always malted barley, yeast, and water. You could also say the barrel, right, would be the fourth ingredient. But generally, the three ingredients in single malt Scotch whiskey accepted as malted barley, yeast, and then also that water as well. So we never deviate from that recipe. but how we put a whiskey together is going to vary from skew to skew to skew to bottling to bottling to bottling, which I think is poetic and magical.
So let me ask you a question. Ardbeg 10, the Ardbeg 10 we're tasting now, would it be essentially identical to the Ardbeg 10 from, let's say, a decade ago?
That's a great question. God, right off the bat, you're going to throw me a curveball like that? That's messed up, man. No, just kidding. Yes. So structurally, there are going to be differences, and that's actually one of the funnest tastings I believe that we did in 2017, I want to say, was essentially, a decade's worth of different bottlings from Ardbeg. On the back of Ardbeg, all Ardbeg bottles, you won't be able to see it if I hold it up. Where are you? Because it's a little bit faded. You won't be able to see it, but on the back, it'd be the back left side, you'll actually be able to see the bottling ID number. And there's actually a website called the Ardbeg Project where you can go online and look up some of the past bottlings, and you can find out what date they were bottled on. You can find out which bottling line they came from as well, what market that whiskey was originally intended for as well. And it's actually really fun because you will be able to find discernible differences, minute differences, from batch to batch to batch. It's like looking at the same painting, from a different vantage point every single time, which I think is, again, magic.
That's wonderful. So I have a question for you, because I know that you called yourself an educator, and I love that. Okay, I love that you're calling yourself an educator. So the people here on this call, we've had many tastings. We've been going to tastings for years, but I still like hearing from people like you. When you're tasting a whiskey, what do you do? Talk about the nose, the look, and then the mouthfeel. Can you talk us through that?
Wonderful. Yeah, I think that especially with groups like this, where we're not just tasting to decide, do we like it or do we not like it. We're looking to taste with a purpose. And that means that we're peeling back layers. And to do that, you need to have a regimented approach. You can't have a chaotic approach, which is different every single time, right? So there is a windup, if you will, to tasting whiskey. And it looks different for everybody. Some people love to toss whiskey about. That's fine. That is totally their deal. Whenever I'm analyzing a whiskey, one of the first things that I'm always going to do is going to be to check the color. First and foremost, we are visual drinkers and eaters. We have so many different weapons to be able to utilize to determine, first off, if something is safe for us or not, right? In prehistoric times, when we were hunters and gatherers, we chose and we gathered things based on their color, Generally things that were this bright red. I know I have this bright red light down to my right here. Generally things that were bright red may not necessarily have been ripe, or maybe they were poisonous. So you can learn a lot by looking at something first, right? And so I always approach a glass of whiskey with eager eyes, is how I generally put it first. Whenever I'm kind of looking at and analyzing a whiskey with my eyes first, I'll always tilt the glass to the side. That way I can kind of see the true color of the glass. If I have a piece of paper, I'll generally hold that piece of paper up in front of the glass so I can actually get a great reading on the coloration. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to tilt the glass a little bit away from me to check how far the color stretches away from the heart of the glass. This may be able to tell you a little bit about alcohol by volume as well, which is pretty interesting. And then, as we already approached, we could discern a little bit about the lipid and about the textural sensations that our palate is actually going to experience based on how quickly those legs recede back down into the glass. I haven't even brought this anywhere near my face yet.
Okay. I have to stop you for a second, because you said something that I'd like you to expound upon a little bit more. You said that when you move the glass away from you, okay, when you're eyeing it, that it tells you something about the ABV. Okay, can you tell me what you mean by that, please?
Absolutely. So I'm not physically moving the glass like this, but I will tilt the glass away from me to try to get as much of the liquid out of the bowl of this Glencairn and closer to the lip of the glass. Okay. And what that is doing is that you're actually going to see a separation of, because whiskey is a solution, right? It's not a monolith. There are so many different, there are so many different congeners. There's a lot of water as well already before we even add water. So you can see the separation start to happen when you move it away from its glass.
I didn't understand what you meant.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and so part of that is actually being able to see ABV. Yeah. Right. So, and that's all of this before we've even taken it to our face. Absolutely. So now on the nose, this is one of my favorite parts about analyzing whiskey. I think that there's no more beautiful relationship in the human body than your olfactory system and your memory, right? These two have a link that is so powerful, right? Whenever we smell something, we're essentially reliving sensations, moments from years, decades ago as well. So smelling a whiskey is, to me, one of the most powerful tools that we can possibly have to be able to discern quality. My first engagement of a whiskey is generally going to be from about my chin level, because I'm not looking to just dive my nose straight down into this, this amalgamation of different, some more high volatility, I guess, like lipids and alcohols like that. I don't want to just overpower my nose. So I want to take that first engagement from about chin level. For me, whenever I engage with Ardbeg 10 from this distance, that sea spray, green apple, pear, a little bit of green pepper as well. A waxiness becomes apparent. As I dive my nose a little bit deeper, it becomes a little bit more mucky. I love my Ardbegs mucky. I like Ardbeg tenure because it's a balance of that muck and that levity. So there's
that might be the first time that anybody on this has used the word mucky. I love it. That's great.
Score one for Cameron. Score one. Doing a great job today. So I love that muckiness. When I dive my nose even deeper down into that glass and I really start examining, now that I'm comfortable, my olfactory system isn't going to be, I guess, adversely affected by the existence of some higher volatility alcohols, as well as, the incredible phenols, right? The phenol is what is going to give you a lot of those meaty aspects. It's going to give you a lot of this beautiful kind of smoke. It's going to give you this soot, this tar. All of the really beautiful things that we love about Ardbeg can be attributed not only to the production, but then also to the existence of the phenolic compounds. And that's what I'm really getting when I dive my nose in.
I have to tell you something that, so many of us have had Ardbeg 10 before. Okay, we've all been drinking these beers. And of course, you start branching out to different brands, and drinking having different bottles and going for things in weird casks or things that are old or things that are younger. It's great every once in a while to just go back to an old standby and remind yourself how damn good it is. And I appreciate this. I really do appreciate it. It's delicious. It's wonderful. But we have to move on because we have other whiskeys here to taste. And I'd like you to tell us about the Wee Beastie. I actually have a bottle of Wee Beastie. It was a gift to me from our friend Michael Nolan, who's one of our regulars. And tell us about the Wee Beastie, which has one of the best names of a whiskey that I've ever seen.
Right. It's just absolutely incredible. This whiskey is so strategic and so perfect in so many different ways. Because as all of you are such great Ardbeg fans, you will remember the peaty path to maturity, right? Ardbeg very young, Ardbeg still young, Ardbeg almost there, Ardbeg Renaissance, and then Ardbeg tenure. So that's essentially how we took a defunct distillery that was really set to be demolished in 1997 and built up a catalog and a backstock of whiskey that would allow us to be able to put out Ardbeg tenure every single year. So we built Ardbeg tenure on the back of significantly young whiskey, intentionally young whiskey, because peated whiskeys have a habit of showcasing themselves, or at least Ardbeg. I've been able to taste quite a few other youthful peated whiskeys. I tried some Ardnahoe straight off of the still right before lockdown. Bunnahabhain, I've had a 2-year delicious Bunnahabhain. Technically not a single malt at that age. Had some wonderful Lafroigs that showcase some pretty interesting aspects at a young age. But Ardbeg, more so than any other peated whiskey distillery, I think achieves success at a younger age. I think part of that can be attributed to the oddities of Ardbeg's production process. fermentation, all wooden washbacks, the only peated whiskey distillery making whiskey on a still that has a purifier hanging off the line arm as well. So there's a lot of weirdness that's happening at Ardbeg.
And
that
this is
allows
sherried, right? And then some of this is from a sherry cask. Is that correct?
Yep, absolutely. Nailed it. Yeah.
Okay.
So about 55% of this would actually be ex-bourbon. About 45 is going to be sherry cask.
Okay.
I had the distinct pleasure of helping make this, actually.
Really? I am incredibly jealous. And one other question I have for you before we, move on to other things. So when it says 5 years on here, okay, so it says, we Beastie, it says on here very clearly, guaranteed, 5 years old. There are things in here that are older than 5 years, right? It's just that the minimum is going to be 5, so that's why it's called 5 years, right?
Perfect. I don't even know why I'm leading, why I'm even talking about Ardbeg. You've got all the talking points. You nailed them all. Yeah. Yeah. So of course, with single malt Scotch whiskey, anytime you see an age statement, that is of course the youngest whiskey in that batch or in that bottling. Right. For wee Beastie, there are some whiskeys that are a little bit older. I will say like a whiskey like Ugadal, which if we're committee members, we'll be very familiar with Ugadal. Even if we're just whiskey fans in general, you'll be very familiar with Ugadal. Ugadal is a non-age statement whiskey that has quite a bit of older stock in it. Again, it's a non-age statement. So if I applied an age statement to it, Dr. Bill and Jillian and the whiskey creation team would be very upset, because then we'd have to go back and change the entire strategy and make it an age statement to whiskey. But a whiskey like Ugadal,
and then Eric would have to
much older stuff.
And Eric would have to delete things from the recording, right? Because we don't want to get you in trouble. Okay.
Cut it. Get it out of here.
Yeah.
That's
Please don't cause me.
Right.
By the way, you'll like to know that at my daughter's bat mitzvah, which is now almost 7 years ago, I had a whole table of whiskeys. I had rye, I had bourbon, I had Irish, I had a Highland, and I had a Springbank, and I also had and then the Isla that I had was Ugadal, okay, because it just, it's such a great bottle. It's such amazing stuff. So the wee Beastie, has it been well received in the marketplace?
Absolutely. This has been one of the best launches for an Ardbeg core range extension that we've had in quite some time. As you know, Ardbeg Anno launched in 2017. Did a great job. It ended up winning quite a few different awards. But the splash, the splashy effect that the labeling for Ardbeg wee Beastie, the way in which this whiskey was actually compiled and put together has been just incredibly well received. I think it adds levity, and it's very much so on brand for Ardbeg to make a whiskey that is cheeky and kind of funny, but incredibly delicious at the exact same time.
And it's also and it's at a good price point too. I mean, let's face it, it's at a good price point too. It's not, there are a lot of whiskeys that are well over $100, and this is, to have something in the $50 to $60 range like the wee Beastie is in some places is quite good. You mentioned something about the brand that I did want to make sure that I asked you here. So I believe that Ugadal was the first bottle of whiskey that I ever bought that did not have an age statement on it. Okay. And, here we're talking, wee Beastie, Ugadal, Korvreken, Anno, Black. What is it about Ardbeg that you decided at some point that you would put out whiskeys with names as opposed to ages on them?
Yeah. Again, I think it has a lot to do with the resurgence of the brand, right? The distillery was set to be knocked down in 1997. I've seen photos of the distillery from the early 90s, and it was not in good shape. It was knackered, is what Dr. Bill and Brendan would have called it. This knackered distillery that was really falling apart. Our good friends next door at Lefroy would kind of come over and basically kick the tires on the thing, make sure that it wasn't going to totally fall apart. But the distillery ended up closing in 1995. It was already shuttered, but they ended up ceasing all distilling operations. There were seasonal distillation operations that happened at Ardbeg from 1991 until 95. In 95, the boiler ended up basically almost exploding, and Lefroy decided we're not going to operate the distillery at all anymore, right? And so when the brand was, when the distillery was sold to the Glenmorangie Company in 1997, they bought the brand, they bought the distillery essentially for a little over 5 million euros. Well, they bought the whiskey at the distillery for about 5 million euros. They bought the distillery for about €1, which is really interesting to me. And it's kind of a funny way that deal worked out, was that they were actually buying back some of the stock. That stock would have been Ardbeg 1977, 75, 78. Some of the earlier things like Lord of the Isles. So that stock of whiskey disappeared really fast.
Yeah, I would think so.
Right? But it disappeared very, very fast. So to rebuild from 1997 all the way into today, we had to harness the power of young whiskey, and we had to harness the power of non-age statement whiskeys that would allow us to make whiskey to a flavor profile rather than be handcuffed by age.
That's a great answer. No, that actually explains it, and that's a great answer. I love that answer. Before we move on to the next one, I want to make sure that you tell me how we pronounce this one that starts with the letter C.
Yeah, of course. Korivrekken.
Okay.
Yeah, you got to roll the R. Very funny. They always make fun of me, say my brogue is no good, and that I have to focus on rolling the R. Korivrekken.
That's really funny. So let me ask you a question before we actually go on to taste the Korivrekken. We have a few people on here who are mixologists, who themselves like to mix drinks together. And I'm really curious about this. I know that many people on your side of the table at the tasting say that we should enjoy it however we enjoy it. Do we enjoy it with water? We enjoy it with ice, whatever. Can you tell us a little bit about some of your favorite cocktails to mix, that you mix with Ardbeg expressions, and then we'll talk about Korivrekken. But I really wanted to ask you this question because most people on here don't know that you actually were a mixologist and a bartender in San Francisco before you took on this gig. And I wanted to make sure that we pick that part of your brain tonight. So if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I am all for people drinking whiskey however they want to, right? Like you said, whether it's neat, whether it's on rocks, whether it's ice, whether it's with Buckfast. Inside joke for my Ardbeg family, we drink this a thing that we call Bucky Reckons, which is actually Buckfast, which is like a tonic wine. It's beloved in Scotland, and we actually mix it with Korivrekken. Not the most delicious cocktail I've ever had, but it gets the job done if you're looking for an imbibe for the night, right?
Nice.
But with actually making cocktails, I think that Scotch whiskey has at times, not necessarily been viewed as something that can be used in cocktails. I find Scotch whiskeys to be incredibly diverse. 140 so odd distilleries, all making whiskeys that are intrinsically different from each other, right? So with Ardbeg, knowing that Ardbeg showcases this chemical compound called limonene, which is one of my favorite aromatics, gives you a lot of citrus up front. Whenever I taste tenure, it's always very, there is that smoke, there is that coal, that soot, that tar, but then also, like we said, there's a little bit of that limonene, that lime kind of oil. There's a little bit of that pear and green apple aspect as well. So my favorite cocktail with Ardbeg tenure is actually just a classic daiquiri spec. And that is traditionally 2 ounces of rum, 3/4 of an ounce of lime, and 1/2 ounce of simple syrup. I don't like my cocktails overly sweet. I want to make sure that I taste the spirit. So instead of the rum, I sub in Ardbeg tenure. It's a high ester spirit, similar to rum, right? Obviously, very different styles of spirit. But the effect is really lovely and very beautiful. For Ardbeg tenure, that's one of my favorites. And for Wee Beastie, I would say that, and Wee Beastie was actually made to go into cocktails. That was when I say I had a hand in helping make this, is I actually got to choose the orientation of how much ex-bourbon cask to how much sherry cask, and then also the proof. Right?
Wow, that's such an amazing opportunity, because usually the brand ambassadors are not involved in that level of the production process.
At all. I was humbled when Dr. Bill and Brendan reached out, for me to join in on the exercise. They sent 25 whiskeys, right? 25 sample bottles.
Mhm.
It was basically 5 categories, right? So you had batch 1, let's just call it batch 1, sample A would be, batch 1 would be 50% ex-bourbon, 50% sherry. Batch 2 was 60-40, then 70-30, then 60-40 the other way, and then, obviously 70-30 the other way, right? And so we tasted, and then all of those at different proofs. So 5 batches, 5 different proofs, 25 whiskeys.
Wow.
And it was incredible. It was
What a
one of the best
process.
experiences of my life.
I am jealous. That sounds absolutely amazing. And that so what I would like to do now, since you did answer my question about the mixing, because I was very curious about that. I know people here are interested in that. Let's go on to the Korivrekken. Okay, so
Love it.
tell us about the Korivrekken, how it's different from the 10 and the Wee Beastie, and what is it about it that makes it special?
And there's so much there. Korivrekken, obviously named after the Korivrekken whirlpool. The whirlpool actually sits basically off the coast of Isla, almost smack dab in between Isla and Jura. It's basically at the head of the channel that separates those two. The whirlpool gets its name, and that's actually something that we wanted to talk about as well, is that the naming of a lot of the bottlings from Ardbeg have to do with iconic landmarks on Isla, or obviously waterways as well. So the Korivrekken whirlpool gets its name from Prince Vrekken, who is a Danish prince who actually fell in love with the daughter of the Lord of the Isles. She was essentially a princess. She was incredibly gorgeous. He fell in love with her basically at first sight, asked her father for her hand in marriage. He said, "You look like an absolutely, upstanding young chap, very much so like myself." And he said, "I will gladly give you my daughter's hand in marriage if you stay 3 nights in the whirlpool." And so he says, "All right, well, that's a lot to take in. So let me go home. Let me kiss my mom goodbye. Let me say goodbye to my dad just in case." He's like, "I'm a strong guy, but just in case anything happens, let me go say bye to my family." So he returns home, and he actually has 3 ropes made for him. These ropes would actually hold his anchor, right? So the first one that he had was made of twine. The second one that he had was made of hemp, and the third one that he had made was made of the finest maiden's hair. That's a PC way of saying that these women were apparently had their virtue still intact. Let's put it that way. And so he had these 3 ropes made, and he returns to Isla to take up the challenge. Night 1, he puts down the rope that's made of twine, and the whirlpool pulls and it pulls and it pulls, and just after daybreak, the rope snaps, but he gets away. He survives. Night 2, he puts down the rope that's made of hemp. The whirlpool pulls and it pulls and it pulls, and just before daybreak, or just after daybreak, I apologize, the rope snaps. And then on day 3, he puts down the rope that is made with the finest maiden's hair. The whirlpool pulls and it pulls and it pulls, and just before daybreak, this time it snaps, and his vessel is actually pulled down under the waves. His dog, who apparently he took with him onto the vessel for this mission, bad dog dad, actually ended up surviving and getting away. Apparently and allegedly, it dragged his body to shore, but he was already deceased. So the whirlpool was forever named the Korivrekken Whirlpool after Prince Vrekken. We've named this whiskey lovingly after that story as well, because this is a ferocious and tenacious whiskey. It gets onto your palate and it whips around with the ferocity of the whirlpool, bringing you flavors like essentially like black pepper, paprika, sea salt, and a little bit of chocolate, baker's chocolate, like dry cacao as well. This is one of my absolute favorite whiskeys, almost cask strength, 57.1% alcohol by volume. Beautiful whiskey.
Oh, it's great. And the thing is that, to me, I mean, we talked about how to drink your whiskeys. This is one of those high proof whiskeys. I don't think it needs water. Okay. I like it as is. But obviously, again, there's no right or wrong. What about you?
So this is a really interesting dram, because something magical, again, to use our word, happens when you do add water to this whiskey. Again, I'm a proponent of drinking whiskey however the heck you want to, right? With Ardbeg Korivrekken, adding a splash or just a couple of drops of water does something magical to it. It actually, for me, it kind of rounds off a little bit of that tempest up front, a little bit of that black pepper kind of steps to the side, and you actually see the presence of vanillin, right? A little bit more of that vanilla and creme brulee and custard element steps to the forefront. It gives it this silken characteristic that you might otherwise miss if you don't add water to it. Another way that you can coax that out of this dram, which I'm not as big a proponent of, is actually to just leave it alone for 5 to 10 minutes. I apologize, somebody driving a motorcycle past. But to leave it alone for 5 to 10 minutes, you actually see a settling of a lot of the more volatile, congeners and aromatics. Some of those things will escape, and this whiskey will kind of find its own it'll move into balance. Not to say it's unbalanced or out of balance, directly out of the bottle. But for those who are looking for that silken kind of soft textural experience, it develops over time. And the reason I say I'm not a fan of doing that is because I want my whiskey and I want it right now.
And this is virgin oak. Is a new oak cask. Is that correct?
Yep. So again, remember, Ardbeg, these whiskeys are assembled. We don't finish whiskeys, right? So the heartbeat of this is always going to be ex-bourbon cask. So if somebody was like, how much ex-bourbon cask is there? I would have to say that there's probably about 80% ex-bourbon cask that goes into Corrie of Reckon. That remaining 20% has spent its entire life in French oak. And that French oak is such an interesting species to be able to age spirits in, because French oak is a little bit more, not a little bit, it's actually much higher in tannins than American oak is. So American oak, it has a lot more lignin. That's why whenever you taste like bourbons, for instance, you always get that creme brulee and that custard and that fennel and dill, right?
And a lot of sweetness,
and a lot of sweetness. Whereas French oak, it has a lot more tannins. So think about like your Syrah, Grenache, Mourvedre, if you're wine drinkers as well. That like tannic nature that gets your juicers kind of going down the sides here. You see a lot of that represented in this whiskey because 20% of it spent its life in virgin French oak casks.
Got it. So I'm going to ask you one more question before we open it up to the group. What's it been like to be a brand ambassador during the time of COVID?
It's so weird. I feel like I was just kind of getting my groove, getting my groove back before COVID, and before social distancing and lockdown. It was wonderful. We would be doing this in person. We would be sharing these drams in person. We would be, we would end up probably having an after party, even out at Delilah's probably.
Right.
This experience would be, the messaging that I would try to communicate would be the exact same, but the vehicle would have been quite a bit different. So being an ambassador during COVID has been challenging because we are generally pretty outgoing people that are driven by interactions and engagements, right? And so instead of getting to put my arm around y'all as we're having, drams an entire evening, I get to raise,
bear hug,
exactly, bear hugs. I get to raise a glass with you virtually instead. I will say I've learned a lot of new skills, videography, photography as well. I've had some time to dive and delve into even more of my own education as somebody who is interested in not only Ardbeg, but the world of single malt whiskeys and the world of whiskey as well. So recently just passed my level 2 of Masters of Scotch, getting ready to sit for the final exam in Scotland, hopefully in September.
Wow.
To see what happens.
That's amazing.
And hopefully joining the Council of Whiskey Masters after that. So very, very excited about it.
That's wonderful. And, it's funny because that's exactly why Eric and I started this. As you know, the lockdown started right before Whiskey Week here in Chicago, right before Whiskey Fest and Binny's World of Whiskeys. And many of us on this call have been going to whiskey tastings together for at least 15 years. Okay, for many, many years, some of us longer. And when that was taken away from us, it was something that Eric and I decided we needed to do something. And this is, how we've ended up here, and it's really been one hell of a ride. We're going to continue it after the lockdown ends, obviously not as frequently, but we've built something here, because the nice thing about what we've done is that we've also brought in people from other parts of the country, not just Chicago, to participate with us, and we've made new friends too in different places. So it's been a very good learning experience, and it's also been one of those things where we've loved being able to interact with people like you and learn from you really on more of a one-on-one, because as you know, at those events, you're being pulled left and right by many, many people. So what we're going to do right now, Eric, do you have any particular questions for Cameron?
Well, kind of a follow-up on how things were during the lockdown. I mean, now that you're actually not at home and you're on the road, how is that? How are you seeing things change? And kind of like, where do you see things progressing now that we have a vaccine and things are starting to open up?
I think that this may be the new normal. It used to be like Cam wakes up at 4 o'clock in the morning and goes to the airport, takes his bag of whiskeys and goes and jumps on an airplane to, whatever city it is for 2 days, and then travels to another city for another 2 days, and then goes home. I think how this will start to evolve is, I think that this will actually kind of be the new normal, where I will touch down in a city, and instead of only bringing my wonderful bag of whiskeys, I'll also have to bring my camera, my monitor, a bunch of cables, my Elgato setup, which helps me use my DSLR camera as a webcam, essentially. So I think that I'm probably going to have to bring all of those things and assets with me on the road as we return to doing whiskey tastings in person. But to Gil's point, you mentioned something that I thought was absolutely just dead on, that these are almost more engaging, and it's almost more of a one-on-one environment that has been fostered. And so there's value to that. For all of us as consumers and as enjoyers, and people who are enthusiasts of whiskey, there's value for that, because we get to learn a little bit more. And as somebody who literally is wearing a brand hat, there's value for us as the brand to be able to take the time, to not have to rush through pouring 1,000 samples in one day and only being able to talk to a group of, 30 people for an hour, all of the seminars and whatnot that I used to do at Whiskey Fest and World Whiskey and things like that as well. So I believe that the new normal, as we have the vaccine or the vaccines, is probably going to be some in-person events, but then also a lot of digital activations, as they call them, for us ambassadors.
Great. That was a great question, Eric, and that was a great answer. Eric, why don't you moderate the questions? Everybody, please, to keep some order here, please use the raise hand function. It's under the reactions button where you can raise the hand. So Eric, a few people have already raised hand. I think that Todd or Jeff was first, I think.
Okay.
Right.
I'll go alphabetically. Let's hit Ariel.
So you were mentioning, thank you for being here, by the way. You were mentioning Cameron being the brand ambassador with the shirt and everything. Can we get a shot of your shirt with the horns? I assume that's different than Paul's that doesn't have horns.
Yep. So this is one of the, actually 2020, I believe, was the first year where there were 2 Ardbeg Day shirts that were made. So one was just the bottle with the hand, and then the other one has the horns on it as well. Very cheeky, very Ardbeggy, and I was just in love with this shirt from the second I saw it. Definitely holding a few of these hostage back home.
Yeah, and the other question was, how can I represent Ardbeg in the school pickup line with one of those hats?
Absolutely. Let's go ahead and get your information. I'll see if I can commandeer a couple more of these hats and send them out your guys' way.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Looks like he's locked up. Looks like Ariel's locked up. Let's go into Todd.
Yep.
So I feel like one of the interesting conversations that's happening, at least in American whiskey right now, is applying the concept of terroir to whiskey. And I notice you've talked a lot about how evocative of the geography the Ardbeg whiskey is. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how Ardbeg specifically tries to evoke the geography of the distillery and of Islay and produce a whiskey that really could be produced nowhere else.
I got to give a standing ovation for that question right there. That is an absolutely fantastic question. God, you're going to get me. My head is getting ready to explode with how awesome that question was. So terroir is a paintbrush term that is used across so many spirits and wine industries that it is almost bastardized, if I can use that again language. At Ardbeg, we try to stay away from the term terroir, and you may notice that I used another term that's fairly similar, but I think goes a little bit of a layer deeper, right? And that's provenance. And I said that basically at the very beginning of our tasting, because what I think terroir fails to be able to capture is a distillery's, the microflora and fauna that exist in a distillery. That has nothing to do with where you sourced your malted barley or your green barley from, right? That has everything to do with a distillery's thumbprint and its DNA. If we took the recipe and the production style of Ardbeg out of the Ardbeg distillery, the whiskey that we would make would not be Ardbeg. Provenance also captures the human element, the hands that make that make the whiskey. The decisions to run the fermentation times a little bit longer in the winter than in the summer. Those human elements are part of Ardbeg's genetic makeup as well. And by using the term terroir, you potentially miss those things because you're focused specifically on where the raw ingredient came from when there's so much more to the picture. Ways that Ardbeg evokes this provenance are going to be by sourcing peat from Ardbeg. That is the peat bog that we actually utilize to essentially hew the peat that goes into the malting process not at Ardbeg, at Port Ellen malting facility, where we have all of our malted barley processed, right? They know specifically to utilize Ardbeg, the peat bog, hewn peat, right? Another way that the provenance of Ardbeg is really displayed is in the nonsensical operations of the distillery. And I say that with as much love as I possibly can in my heart. If somebody gave me $5 million and told me to make a distillery and try to make whiskey that was similar to Ardbeg, I can't tell you that I would make the choices that were made in terms of how Ardbeg is set up. There are oddities scattered out throughout the distillery. Fermentation vessel, your wooden washback, right? A lot of whiskey distilleries utilize stainless steel because it's a little bit more efficient. It's a little bit easier to clean. You have better temperature regulation as well. But at Ardbeg, it's important to us to have these wooden washbacks because that's where you get a little bit of that waxiness on the nose as well on the palate. Those things develop in the fermentation. The microbes that exist and kind of find these little crevices. Obviously, wood is porous, so those fermentation vessels have these little crevices for microbes and things like that to hide. So through your fermentation, your first 0 through 36 hours is essentially called pre-break, right? So after that first 36 hours, you move into what you could call, I mean, you'd be right and you'd be wrong. It's more or less a secondary fermentation. Now the yeast are no longer dominating the ferment. Now it's all these weird other secondary microbes and secondary esters that are creating esterification. That's why super long fermentation times generally yield really fruity whiskeys. At Ardbeg, we don't have an incredibly long fermentation time, but it is kind of helped forward by the existence of these microbes, which essentially inform the next ferment based off of the previous one, right? So that is, again, a little bit of that provenance at play as well. And then in distillation, Ardbeg is a weird distillery where the spirit still, so your second still, is larger than your wash still. that makes no sense because you're decreasing in volume as you move through the process, right? So a wash still should be larger than a spirit still, but at Ardbeg, it's not. So at Ardbeg, once we run the wash still once, that low line as it comes off goes into a charger, and we have to run that wash still again and fill that charger, because that one wash fills the charger halfway, the second one fills it to the top. Then together, those two distillates move into the final distillation process, which is the spirit still. So that's weird right there in and of itself, that there's a separating of different fusels and different congeners, essentially, and different organic compounds in that charger. That's something that I haven't really encountered in many other, for sure, no other peated whiskey distilleries on Isla utilize that process as well. So again, these are all things that are about provenance, but you miss when you use the term terroir.
Awesome. Thanks. Great answer.
Of course.
Thanks, Todd. Jeff, you're next.
Hey, good to see you, Cameron. I will have a much less technical question here for you. Wondering why this doesn't get a whole lot of love.
Right? That is, God, again, another fantastic question. I feel like Ardbeg NO has, it was before Wee Beastie, it was our most recent core range extension. We launched that in 2017. It had a good year. It did win, best non-age statement whiskey in 2019 as well. So it had a good year. But it's oftentimes overlooked when we look at the core range or even the offerings just in general from Ardbeg Distillery. And I can't really tell you why 100%, but I have a theory. And I feel like it's because as educated Ardbegians, that's what obviously we refer to Ardbeg committee members as Ardbegians, we saw it as an introductory Ardbeg. And I think somewhere along the line, even in, I think it was even communicated as like a way to get into Ardbeg, when in actuality, Ardbeg NO isn't an intro to Ardbeg. It's basically the master class. That is, for me, Ardbeg NO takes a piece of every other whiskey that we make at Ardbeg and rolls it all into one, right? NO has a heartbeat of ex-bourbon cask, very similar to all of the other whiskeys in the Ardbeg core range, in the style of whiskey that would go into Ardbeg 10-year, first and second fill ex-bourbon cask, makes up the heartbeat. The accenting casks or the accenting characters in the play are going to be Pedro Jimenez sherry cask. We see sherry cask as an idea that's being borrowed from a whiskey like Wee Beastie or a whiskey like Ugadal, right? Both of those rely on sherry cask, but instead of using Oloroso sherry cask like NO or like Wee Beastie and Ugadal, we've made the decision to use Pedro Jimenez sherry cask. And then there's the existence of virgin oak, an idea that's borrowed from Corey Brecken, right? But instead of using virgin French oak, it's virgin American oak. So it uses some of the ideas from each of the other whiskeys in the core range, which I think is absolutely beautiful. And it rounds them all together. And that's a key term right there, rounded, because that's actually how we refer to Ardbeg NO. It's everything that you love about Ardbeg, traditional Ardbeg 10-year, Corey Brecken, Ugadal. Wee Beastie wasn't out when we had launched that product yet. But it takes all of those flavors and then rounds them off just gently with the existence of that virgin American oak.
Awesome. Thank you, Cameron.
Cameron, are you there? Because we lost you for a second there. Are you there, Cameron?
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Yep. Can you hear me?
He's in here.
All right, we're good.
Okay.
We're back. Okay. All right, great. Wonderful. Jeff, does that answer your question?
Yes, sir, it does.
Excellent. Eric, who's next? I think William?
Actually, well, Lynn, I saw asked the question. Do you want to answer yours now or later?
Don't care.
Okay, well, why don't you ask yours now?
Oh, okay. I'm just curious, Cameron, sounds kind of interesting to me. How did you decide to go from being a mixologist in San Francisco to a brand ambassador for Scotch and particularly Ardbeg? I mean, to me, it's like, wow. How'd you decide to do that?
That's a great question. So my love of Scotch and my love of Scotland actually stems from when I was a kid. Even my name, my Cameron George, is actually a Scottish name. Cameron actually in Gaelic means crooked nose. I like to believe that my nose is straight and beautiful. But there's always been, even down to my name, there's been a connection to Scotland. And then when I was a kid, I actually remember, my family, I grew up in Seattle, Washington. And I remember we had an exchange student who came and lived with us during the summers. And her name was Abigail. And I remember when I was, I don't know, maybe, and she was originally from Inverness. Now she lives out on the Shetland Isles. And I remember, when I was maybe seven years old, about 4 years after she had, come to stay with us, she actually got married, and she invited my parents to her wedding, and my parents took my little sister and I. Probably not the most enjoyable trip. You have a rambunctious 7-year-old like myself and my little sister, who is wonderful, the most brilliant person that I know, but was a loud little child. We traveled throughout the Scottish Highlands, and then also went out to the Shetland Isles. And I remember playing in a peat bog, and I remember feeling like this dirt and this mud is really cool. And her husband, or her fiance at the time, saying that's not mud, this is peat. And I remember learning that lesson at 7 years old. So fast forward into me stepping into the bar, I was learning as much as I could about spirits as fast as I possibly could. And I gravitated towards Scotch whiskey because it was one of the only countries I had actually visited. The stories, the legends, all of those things mattered to me, right? There was already a connection and a tie-in. And then as I progressed through my bartending career, I ended up winning several, cocktail competitions and became a fairly well-known bartender. And the brands of Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy, so that is the parent company to the Glenmorangie Company, who is the parent company to Ardbeg, offered me a position in California as the ambassador for all of their spirits. So Glenmorangie, Ardbeg, Hennessy, Belvedere as well, Volcan, so all of the spirits that they made. And about a year into that, I actually ended up meeting the brand director and Mickey Heads as well, as Mickey was on a West Coast tour at the time. And I set up an event, and I'd already visited the distillery maybe 3 years before that. And I was in love with Ardbeg. I was in love with the place. I was in love with the whiskey. And Derek, who was the brand director, was like, yeah, we were setting up this tasting, and then Cameron, you just kind of started talking about the brand and ran with it. And so about 6 months later, I woke up to a phone call, and it was the brand director, Derek, saying hey, on the down low, we got a position funded for Ardbeg's national ambassador. This job is incredible. It's going to be a fantastic position. This is not me offering you this job. This is me saying that we would like you to apply for this job, but you have to go get it. And somehow fought my way through a little over 500 people who applied for the position. And the rest is history.
Awesome. Thank
That's
you.
an amazing story. Thank you, Lynn, for asking that. Eric, am I correct that we have Josh and then William?
Yep.
All right. Josh Eisenberg, please unmute.
All right. Thank you so much. This has been great. So I am admittedly a little bit newer to Scotch versus rye is my one of the whiskeys that I enjoy very much. So I've been learning a lot. And I was wondering, Cameron, if you could talk a little bit more specifically for Ardbeg 10 about the aging and maturation process. So you talked about the sourcing of the barrels coming from different partners to provide different characters. I'm curious how that's evolved over time, given Ardbeg's history and changeover, becoming part of the new ownership and so forth. So is there anything else you can share about how those decisions are made for Ardbeg 10 specifically, in terms of how you maintain the consistency and how you source those barrels?
Absolutely. That's a great question. Thank you for asking that one. That's a fantastic one as well. So I would say that the Glenmorangie company being purchased by Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy has done nothing but help the brand. It has allowed Dr. Bill Lumsden to have one of the most robust oak budgets in the whiskey creation game. Dr. Bill will spend, generally a little over $8 million a year on oak alone. That level of investment to the cask like regiment is absolutely incredible, and that's vital, especially for a distillery like Ardbeg, where we can't just take it out of ex-bourbon cask and then throw it into like Marsala or like Pedro Jimenez sherry cask or red wine cask and experience a massive effect, right? We need to be able to lay that spirit down for a long time in whatever that unique cask is. So in the case of a whiskey like Ardbeg 10-year, it genuinely is only ex-bourbon cask. I said first and second. In all honesty, sometimes they will use a little bit of cheeky third fill ex-bourbon cask. At Glenmorangie, they stick very hard and fast to that first and second fill ex-bourbon cask rule, for the original at Glenmorangie. At Ardbeg, we may sneak in a little bit of third fill every now and then, but it is always ex-bourbon cask for the 10-year. The sourcing of these casks, if you were to walk through our warehouses at Ardbeg, we use what's called dunnage style warehouses. So here in the States, we are very, very, very fond of our rick house, right? Our rick house style warehouses, which are generally, about five levels high, right? And will experience massive temperature fluctuation from the top to the bottom floor. There's a massive temperature difference. There's a massive atmospheric pressure difference as well, right? In single malt Scotch whiskey, they primarily use what's called dunnage style warehouses. And these are generally earth floor, so they don't even put down like wood on the floor or anything like that. And generally, the cask will just be stacked too high, right? Very, very long warehouses, just stacked too high. A little bit more consistency in terms of the temperature fluctuation, and for sure more consistency in terms of the atmospheric pressure and whatnot as well. There was something that I wanted to say as well to you, and that is that on Islay, maturation happens in Scotland. Maturation happens slower than it does in the United States, right? Because it's generally a little bit more temperate. You don't have the massive changes from, think about being in Kentucky or our friend down in Tennessee. It is very hot, very humid during the summer times, and then during the winter it can get mighty frigid, mighty cold, very, very cold. So that temperature fluctuation is literally going to force that cask to breathe, moving that spirit in and out of the pores, out of that, in and out of what's called the red line. If you were to crack a barrel of whiskey in half, not hot dog style, hamburger style, and you were to look at the inside of a cask, you would actually see a red line that ran through that cask. And that's essentially where that oak or where that spirit is moving into, right? That's as deep as it actually gets into the wood. The older a barrel gets, the closer to the outside of that cask the red line ends up moving, right? In single malt Scotch whiskey, because you don't have such massive temperature variations, your angel share is going to be significantly lower than in American spirit production or maturation, right? Specifically bourbon, rye, and American single malt whiskey, right? On Islay, it's actually a little bit hotter a year round than it is in mainland Scotland. Like if you were up in Glasgow or over in like Campbelltown even. It's actually quite a bit warmer on Islay than it is anywhere else in Scotland, other than the other Hebridean islands. That's the chain of islands that runs up and down the west coast of Islay or of Scotland. So those islands benefit from like trade winds. So it's actually generally, you can feel quite a warm breeze blowing over Islay and over Jura and the other Hebridean islands almost year round. Which is quite interesting, right? So maturation on Islay happens a little bit faster than anywhere else in Scotland, but definitely much slower than anywhere else, much slower than the United States.
That was a great and comprehensive answer. And we have Eric, am I right? We have one more question from William Myers, correct? Bill, please unmute.
Okay.
Great.
So,
Yes.
let's see here.
Love your back
So-
bar. Oh, that's beautiful.
You like those?
Love it. Love it. Love it. Huge fan.
So I was going to ask a couple of things. One, I was going to ask what your favorite Ardbeg expression is. And then I was also going to ask if you could tell us a little bit about the composition of the Ardbeg and the 25.
Absolutely. Great questions. My favorite Ardbeg is actually the 10-year. There is this, the distillery to me feels like home. And I've been very lucky to get to travel over there usually two times a year for basically the past 3 years. I generally stay at the distillery when I'm there, and I'm generally drinking Ardbeg 10-year quite late into the night when I'm there as well. So it really does kind of feel like home to me. And the 10-year very much so reminds me of the distillery. It reminds me of hanging out and laughing around the fire, with Duggar, who's like one of the warehouse men. It reminds me of hanging out with Jackie and telling jokes into the wee morning, and hanging out down at some of the pubs, in Port Ellen. All of those things are immediately kind of like come right back to the forefront of my mind whenever I have a glass of Ardbeg 10-year. Other than the 10-year, I would have to say Arnhem Bashed is probably my favorite because that was the first Ardbeg. That was actually the first Ardbeg that I ever had. I've got a couple of bottles. I've got far less than I would like to have, but that's definitely a close runner-up to Ardbeg 10. And then in terms of composition of Ardbeg, I don't have a hook. I don't have a Captain Hook hand. I don't know why I did that. Ardbeg is, relies again on the heart and soul of that is aged in ex-bourbon cask, but the flair, the fringe pieces have spent their whole life maturing in rye cask, which I think is wonderful. Our wonderful partners at the Brown-Forman Cooperage and the Brown-Forman Company, have been kind enough to supply us with some of the finest casks in the world. I think that Dr. Bill loves them because they have almost complete control over, the production of their casks. The Jack Daniel's, Woodford Reserve, and Old Forester, those are all whiskeys that are owned by Brown-Forman. They're essentially the only, United States, large-scale United States, like whiskey producing distilleries that also make their own barrels as well. And so the element of control that they're able to have over, over these casks and quality control, that we effectively get to harness as well because of our relationship with them, is I think why Dr. Bill returns to them and their cooperage anytime we need an oddity cask that is generally American oak, right? He does source, things like European oak, French oak, like Malmsey sherry and all these other strange casks from other suppliers. But if it's something that is American oak, we're probably going to be working with the Brown-Forman Cooperage. And then Ardbeg 25-year, what a dram, what an absolutely insane dram. Talk about unobtainium, whiskey that basically shouldn't exist. If you're good at math, like myself, like I'm terrible at math, you can go back and you'll see that whiskey should have been laid down in 1996. Which is basically around the time when the distillery would have totally gone dark and silent, right? From 1981 until 89, there was a closure. There was a full production year where the distillery made about 600,000 liters of spirit. In 1990, just to put that in perspective, in the 1880s, Ardbeg was making about 1.4 million liters of spirit. Now today we make about 1.4, 1.5. That will increase as we have added a new set of stills as well. But in 1996, there shouldn't have been a whole lot of whiskey being distilled at that time. And so the fact that we set some of that aside for 25 years in ex-bourbon cask is incredible. And the fact that it survived and that it wasn't used for anything else beforehand, I'm just in love with.
Okay, that was a great way to finish this up. Bill, that was a great question. Cameron, that was a great answer. I want to tell everybody one thing very interesting here about Cameron. In preparation for these interviews, I send out to the interviewee a list of draft questions that I'm considering for the interview. And as I mentioned, this was my 26th interview. Cameron is the first person who actually responded with detailed answers to all of the questions. Okay. I didn't even want to read them because I didn't want to know the answers beforehand. And I should have known that we were going to go past an hour considering how comprehensive your written answers were. Give you a mic. I mean, really, I got to tell you something. This has been absolutely amazing. I'd like everybody, if you are so inclined, to put a dram into your glass. I'm finishing off the Cordy Vrecken, which is absolutely amazing. Cameron, I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge and your passion, your enthusiasm for a spirit that we all enjoy and love. And everybody, if you could all please unmute and join me in saying cheers and thank you very much to Cameron George from Ardbeg.
Cheers.
Cheers. Wonderful. Cameron, thank you very much. You want to have any last words before we turn off the recording?
No, I would just say, thank you very much for giving me such an incredible opportunity to engage with you all. Genuinely, some of the best questions that I've actually ever been asked. During our open forum bit. It was genuinely just truly a pleasure and an honor to be able to taste with you all. And I can't wait till we can get to do this in person.
Amen to that. Amen. Thank you very much.